welcome. Today's Roar of Love episode is the art of showing up, and it's about choosing vulnerability when you really want to run. So, today we're exploring another essential part of the spiritual journey, of the life journey, which is the spiritual journey, which is the art of showing up. And so, whether you're feeling spiritually disconnected or relationally overwhelmed or just tired, this is the sacred invitation that still stands no matter what's happening. And that is to show up anyway. So, not with perfection, not with answers, but just as you are. So, let's take a moment and soften and settle and begin. So, first of all, there is a human tendency to withdraw. So, we can start there, right? That all of us at some point in time will want to run, and that we'll want to avoid something that feels too difficult, right? We have fight, we have flight, and we have freeze. So the desire to run is the flight, right? It's one of the things when we don't feel like we can handle what it is that's in front of us. Our tendency is to want to run away. And so there can be all sorts of reasons for this. It can just be that our life, our practice, our spiritual connection has felt dry. Our relationships have felt more challenging than reciprocal. But whatever it is, it's that the showing up just feels too much. It could be that difficult conversation that we need to have, or the risk that we need to take, and whatever it is. And we come to this moment, and our desire is to withdraw, or our tendency is to withdraw. We disconnect, we abandon ourselves. We can hide behind busyness or numbness or even spiritual language, and in order to justify pulling away. So I know this really well, not just from witnessing it on other people, but from walking it in my own life. There have been many moments where the idea of facing another level of vulnerability felt like too much, and where instead I wanted to disappear or to polish the exterior so no one could see quite what it was that was going on. And I learned this pretty early on in my life, because I learned that vulnerability was really unwise, and that it was much smarter to find a different approach. And one of those approaches was to run. And so I learned lots of different ways of running, including mastering forms of pseudo vulnerability. So I became very good at appearing vulnerable while not being vulnerable at all. And even a way losing the lead in myself, right? Of being able to uh, not put the thing on the line that I really needed to put on the line, in order, but to put something on the line. So it's like doing the job. So it became a very clever way of protecting myself. But and the problem was, more than anything else, that it didn't feel like a choice. And that, as I was saying, like sometimes I would even lose sight of the fact that I was doing it. And it took me a really long time to see, and it's actually a project to see, a practice to see where it is, like how I cut myself off from the flow of life and love. And so this is something that can happen along the way, is that we lose the thread of what the risks that we really truly want to take. And, there's an unfortunate thing inside of all of this, because we can actually learn in the course of our lives how to take risks. And we can learn that actually pretty early in life if we're given the foundational pieces that are needed in order to know that risk taking is actually something that benefits us in the long run. We can then use that later in life. But many of us don't learn that, or in fact we can learn the opposite, like I did. And that there were certain risks that I was willing to take. Those did not seem as vulnerable to me. And then there were ones that were really felt very highly vulnerable. And those were the ones that, of course, I tried to avoid, as many people try to avoid the vulnerabilities that they most they don't like the most. So the tendency to withdraw is really just that, right? So it's a tendency, and you can choose what is best for you. And the reason that I'm starting with this place is because, like I just said, sometimes we don't actually, we lose sight of the fact that it is just like a pattern. It's a behavioral pattern. And it can seem like we don't have any choice in the matter anymore, that we've sort of been bested by our instinct for flight. And so we want to learn how to work with that. And the first thing we can do is recognize the fact that it is a tendency, but that we do have choice. And that but through exploring this and understanding it more, we can understand a little bit more of what kind of options are available to us. And so that we have that available when we're pushed to our edge, right? Because really we're expanding our capacity to work in areas that feel risky, that feel challenging. We're learning how to work in these areas with greater proficiency. And no matter who you are, you have some area where you can expand yourself, where you are living in greater limitation than you could. So showing up, right, is like, I like to turn everything into a spiritual practice. So showing up is its own type of spiritual practice, right? It doesn't mean getting it right. It means being willing to stay in relationship with ourselves, with others, with the divine, with wherever we find ourselves, even when it's uncomfortable, and even when there are no clear answers, or even when we'd rather not. And what this does, when we engage, when we are able to just stay that little bit longer in a situation, then it grows our strength, and it grows our confidence in ourselves. And so that's another piece to add to this, is that we're doing this step by step. Everything is really step by step. There aren't a lot of big problems that get solved with like an immediate one size fits all answers. A lot of times what we do is we find ways to make incremental movements forward. And so we don't necessarily get it right. We don't necessarily see the change all at once. We start to make more and more changes as we go. So presence, as you probably know, is foundational to like pretty much every spiritual tradition, right? We always, they're all talking about be more present, right? So we know this. But showing up goes a little bit further, because it's not really just about mindfulness or stillness, it's about engagement, right? So we can sometimes be mindful or aware of a situation, but still not be willing to take the risk to step in. And that risk to step in is really where that vulnerability is. This is where we really get to see ourselves, to learn about ourselves, to get feedback from the outside world. So it's a participation in life. And it's a participation in life when we're tempted to shut down or to check out. And so that's what makes it risky, and that's what makes it vulnerable. but that's also what makes it powerful, is that we're willing to go there and we're willing to sort of like try ourselves, test ourselves in these situations of challenge. So very often we can confuse this with like spiritual performance, right? So we think that we need to like do it right, right? We're going to be perfectly calm. We're going to be expertly grateful. We're going to be spiritually articulate, right? We think that we're going to be able to have it look right, in that moment. Like that's what really this is all about. But it's also about being gritty and raw and much less together than we would like sometimes to be able to pretend. It's all of that. It's the willingness to be all of that. And it's through the being of all of that that we actually create an expanded capacity, not just for ourselves to show up that way, but actually for all people to be able to show up that way. And so to remember that we are pushing back the limits, not just for ourselves, but also for others. It's like we're saying, hey, look, you too can show up and a little bit more inside of this space. Now, that isn't an excuse to just do things without thought or without care or without conscience, right? We're not talking about just like throwing things all over the place. That isn't really vulnerability as much as that is just like kind of like unbridled emoting or expression, which has its place, but it doesn't have as much of a place. So vulnerability is about expanding that container, about willing to go up to the edge, about taking those risks when it's the hardest to do, right? So it is staying with what is. It's not fixing it, it's not escaping, it's not performing. So it's sometimes the smallest acts here that are the biggest, that have the most profound difference, make the most profound difference. So taking a deep breath before a hard conversation, sitting quietly before we reach for our phone, placing our hand on our heart and like reminding ourselves that we're willing to listen to ourselves. Like these aren't the grand gestures, they're anchoring moments. And these anchoring moments help us to like remember like the power of what it is that we're doing. They help us recognize the courage, the often unacknowledged courage. Because very often when we're stepping up to these moments, what we're saying to ourselves is, well, you should be able to. You should know how to do this. You should be bigger or more expanded, or they shouldn't bother you. Like a lot of times there are a lot of shoulds in the mix. And so when we take these anchoring moments, we honor and acknowledge ourselves as we're showing up. We're noting to ourselves, hey, look, like here, you're pausing, you're gathering strength, and you're doing it. You're stepping into this moment of vulnerability. And that's okay too, because sometimes all we have to, sometimes we just hold our nose and jump, right? So it's like, it's nice that it's soft sometimes, but sometimes just jumping in is such a profound act. Being willing to get messy, being willing to not do it right, being willing to take that risk. So it's not really so much about getting noticed or, doing something that kind of like looks a certain way, but noticing, we're returning to what is important. We're recognizing where these powerful moments in time are. We're acknowledging where we're willing to step forward. So this showing up, right? This is courageous work. This is courageous vulnerability. And this is our willingness. We can find it somewhere. You can call to mind some part of your life where you're like, yes, I would really like to show up more in that area of my life. And it's scary. And I don't know how, or I'm feeling overwhelmed, or I can see myself go into all these habits to try to pull away from that stepping in. But showing up does all sorts of things for us, right? It aligns our soul. It breaks the spell of avoidance. It builds our energetic resilience, which is what I was just talking about, and it creates a healing field, right? So, when we show up in that way, we're available to truth. We're available to more of the truth, you could say, because we've been willing to step into the moment and see what's there. See what's there. And sometimes when we take that vulnerable step, that doesn't mean that the response is the world's response or a person's response isn't always exactly what we'd like in that moment, but it helps us learn at least that other person or other perspective, or how the world's responding to our energy in that particular moment. And we get to evolve, we get to take a next step from there. And so it can be hard sometimes, because as we're being vulnerable, especially if it's not fully clarified or developed, we might not like the feedback, but that feedback still helps us align with what is more true inside of ourselves. So it's worth it anyway if we can take the feedback and use it to get to even deeper truth. And that showing up breaks the spell of avoidance. So avoidance creates loops, right? It creates numbing and distracting and delaying. But showing up will break that down. And again, even if it's not ideal, it still interrupts, it interrupts that kind of almost trance like numb state, and opens the door for more choice. Right? So in every time that go against avoidance, we are able to open up more inside of our life. We have the potential for more inside of our life. That doesn't mean we're going to stick with a particular situation, right? So turning towards something, the result might be that we say, oh yes, and I am done with that. I don't want that in my life. But we turn towards it first. We're vulnerable enough to engage with it first, and then we can make that decision about whether or not we want to keep it in our life. If you have long-standing patterns with this kind of stuff, this is challenging. It's going to take some iterations. It's going to take some practice. You're going to need to try at it a little bit, and that can be uncomfortable. But keep trying at it, because the results will be really good. So showing up also builds our muscle. I was talking about that a little bit before, but when we stay present through discomfort, right, we have more strength. We learn to be able to hold more complexity, to be with more truth, to be with more love, to be with more difficulty. So as we are able to expand that capacity, we're not really thrown around as much anymore, because we're more able to stay centered. So we make ourselves vulnerable. We show up. We take a step forward. We do something to create what it is that we want. And this helps us get stronger and stronger. And one of the challenges here is that for many people, we have lost sight of what it is that we truly want. We've dampened down what it is that we think that we can create. We've settled for something smaller than what is actually possible. I'd venture to say that most people have done that in some way in their life. And so we actually need to reverse that. And the only way that we can do it is by risk moving forward, risking. And as we get older, that gets harder. It's like easier. We've got less to lose when we're younger. And then as we get older, it gets more challenging because we have more to lose with every risk that we take. We know it. We know the price like what could happen. We've experienced the disappointments, we've experienced the failures. We've piled up more successes that we want to keep. Yet the being vulnerable, taking those risks, moving out, being willing to let things get a little messy sometimes. Again, not going into the realm of like outright stupidity, not going into the realm of like, driving our car off a cliff, for example. That would be an example, right? But being willing to meet life, being willing to step in all the small ways and the bigger ways that are calling us forward. And as we do this, I was mentioning this before, that this has an effect on others. This is part of how we share the light. This is part of how we make the world a better place. We step in. We are willing to make changes. And as we're willing to step in and make changes, bring in new parts of ourself into the world, bring new things into the world, advocate for certain things. As we do that, we create the potential for people to do something in their life, to make a change, to step in more. So our presence, our willingness to not run and hide, but to step forward helps other people tremendously because they start to believe, okay, I can take that risk too. So it inspires others. So one of the things one of the biggest areas, right, of taking these kind of risks, one of the is other people, right? So one of the biggest frontiers is other people. And so showing up in relationship specifically is perhaps one of the biggest areas for vulnerability that requires the most amount of work. It requires us to be honest when we really want to keep things on the surface, or to soften when we want to shut down, listen when we want to defend, or say something when we would rather not. So I've talked a lot on Roar of Love about relationships as a mirror, relationships as a workshop. And it's not really so much about whether it's easy. It's not so much about where we are in this process. It's really about continuing to learn and continuing to show up, even when that is uncomfortable. So that does not mean staying in every relationship. But it does mean being honest about how you feel and what you need and when you're hiding. So, and we're not going to master that overnight, right? We're going to work with it. We're going to start to kind of mold it or shape it and develop it over time. Our ability to be more forthright, more honest, more direct about what it is that's going on inside. And again, we need to know what's going on inside. And so it's a whole excavation in and of itself. Sometimes we think we know what's going on inside, but we don't actually know what's going on inside. And sometimes we don't even think that we know. So we want to really get clear on that's the self-knowledge, that's the know thyself in all of it. We get clear on ourselves so that we can then be able to communicate it clearly. So communion requires being seen and letting others be seen. So it isn't possible when we're hiding, right? Or running, even though that can feel safe. But we need to actually allow ourselves to be witnesses in both our strengths and our struggles. So that is really important, right? In both our strengths and our struggles. That in order to actually fully show up in and like to say we're not running away, that they're choosing to be there. We're allowing ourselves to be seen in both of these places. And of course, like, usually people like to be seen in their strengths more than their struggle, but that's not always the case. So we want to allow ourselves to be witnessed, and not necessarily just are reflected back what we want others to see in us, right? That we might be putting a lot of effort into people seeing in us. And so we have to like start to breathe through the reflections of others, recognizing that we don't necessarily need to like accept them, but we can receive them. We can receive the perspectives of others. We can allow them to see us in our weakness and in our strength. So many people want safety in order to feel, to be willing to connect, to be willing to be open or vulnerable. And there's a certain degree of that is important, right? Like that we shouldn't make ourselves vulnerable in situations where we don't feel safe, and that those might be good situations to leave, right? However, there's a difference between leaving and running. And there's a difference between cultivating safety in a way that is really healthy and using it as a way to not show up, right? So if you have this idea that you need it to be a safe space in order to be able to show up and be vulnerable, that can sometimes be used as an obstacle, like another block. Like you're really just saying, well, no safe space is really going to be safe enough. Or if I don't like the outcome of what happens here, it's because the space wasn't safe enough, that kind of thing. That becomes a little problematic. So we uh we also don't necessarily need to have that in order to show up fully. We can hold ourselves in a way of, with compassion, with understanding, and to actually cultivate and build a sense of safety around ourselves. And so that takes a little bit of practice of learning how to go into a situation, one, assess whether or not it's truly a problematic situation, right? There is a little bit of that. And then to hold ourselves or work with ourselves to create enough security so that we can be vulnerable. And we can cultivate this, we can develop this over time. And one of the things that we need to do this is to not run, right? So if we run from situations where it feels a little unsettling, we don't actually get to learn the skill of cultivating that inner and outer sense of holding that allows us then to be more engaged. And so that blocks our ability to go deeper inside of relationship. It blocks our ability to be even more, yeah, blocks our ability to go deeper inside of relationship. And one of the things that can block us from deeper communion inside of relationship is wanting to come to a sense of either like understanding or agreement, right? So that is, we agree with each other, and therefore now I feel comfortable sharing myself with you, or I think you might agree with me enough, and therefore I feel comfortable sharing what it is that's going on. But what we can actually do is really value integrity. So standing in our truth, allowing the other person to stand in their truth. That means, of course, doing things if you need to take care of yourself, but that's different than avoiding. It's different than running away. It's a willingness to say, this is what I've got. I'm hearing what you've got. Okay, I'm willing to show up to this in my full capacity. Are you willing to show up to this in your, like, with your truth? And then coming together in that place is and like allowing for that to happen, like allowing enough space for that communication to happen versus kind of getting into agreement or disagreement and sort of getting out of there, whether it's emotionally or physically, like actually leaving the conversation, or just emotionally leaving the conversation, or leaving the verbal engagement, whatever it is. So as we start showing up and as we hold ourselves in greater integrity, we ask that of the people who are around us. That deepens our way of like what's possible. So a couple other points about how to work inside of relationships, show up versus not show up, right? So boundaries can be a form of communication, right? They can actually deepen our honesty and respect. They can allow us to be there more. They in a way, they are a vulnerability. They, in a way, it's showing somebody, hey, listen, this is where my line is. I don't allow this line to be crossed, right? So that is a way of showing up, of stepping in, of taking a risk. Someone can say, well, you shouldn't have that boundary, or I'm not going to respect that boundary, or whatever. But you're saying, hey, nope, this is a clear thing for me. I don't allow this line to be crossed. And it's also important to remember inside of all of this that mistakes are going to happen. That we're like, that if we withdraw, um, or we run away, let's just say that. If we run away when there are mistakes, or there is a miscommunication, or there is reactivity or something like that, if we run away, I'm not saying take a break. I'm saying if we run away, or we make it so that that's not an okay thing to happen, then we're not going to be able to get the benefit of that process, right? So it'd be another way to not show up. So I have to be comfortable with, or develop our comfort with, allowing there to be some bumpiness in the process, right? So when we allow some bumpiness to fit into the process, and we like are comfortable, we're willing to know and communicate our boundaries, and we are willing to step in, not necessarily needing to agree, but to hold a place of our own integrity and a space for someone else's integrity, and to find all of that, to create all of that, or work with those different pieces, so that we're feeling more stable, more secure in the relational exchange. Those are all versions of showing up, right? All of those, there's more, but those are all versions of showing up versus running away, of being vulnerable, of taking risk, of trying, of putting effort in building relationship, versus the reverse. So everywhere that we can do that, right, we're going to see a development of that's, of a relationship. Again, even if that development means the relationship is no more, right? Right. That's a fine development. It's not coming from the running away, from the disruption, from the hiding. So one of the things around this, so first of all, like we if we show up, we get more from life. We change the lives of others, we change our own life, we change what is possible. If we find ways of engaging in relationship where we can create the potential for more, then all of these benefits multiply, right? And one of the things that gets in the way of showing up more to life, and whatever part, whether that's relational, just overall in life, is that we think that we need to be ready for it. So we think that we need to feel aligned or balanced, right? Or whatever it is, that we need to do a little bit more work, that we need to step in a bit further, whatever it is that we tell ourselves that is a version of readiness. That if, like, once I do this, then, right? And this is one of the biggest obstacles in relationship to this particular piece of things showing up, right? The biggest kind of lie or myth or misunderstanding, misdirection that happens is that we need to be ready, and that we will be ready when, or maybe I'll never be ready. Like, sometimes people say that to themselves, but we have to be in the right state to begin. But we actually need to begin right here and now, where we are right now. And just to be clear, you don't need to be ready, right? It's not like, we don't need to feel enlightened or centered or strong or perfect or have everything in place or have our practices down or the right mindset or in a tidy emotional state, right? We really just need to begin. And that is something to hold yourself to. So in the areas where I have the most resistance, where I run the most or I avoid the most, right? I remind myself of this regularly, because I want to put every reason that I have between me and actually doing the thing that I don't want to do. And it's like, oh yeah, but if I just do this, then it will be easier, or it will be better timing, or whatever. I had a really interesting thing said to me recently about this particular topic, and it was about love and caring. And that when you love or care enough, you'll do it, regardless of how difficult it is. So if you're not making the change, if you're not showing up, if you're not stepping in, if you're not having the conversation, it might actually be because you don't care enough. And then that can get a little offensive, right? It's just like, what do you mean I don't care? I care so much that this is driving me nuts, that this isn't changing. I totally understand that. I have that experience myself at times. But there is some truth to that statement, that when we really, really care, when we're willing to let ourselves fully embrace our deepest love or care for a situation, then we will do what it takes. And if that's not there, that's totally fine too. Maybe it's not the place that we should be putting in our effort, but then we can at least, like, wipe our hands of it and walk away. Like, oh, I don't actually want to do that. I'm not running from it. I actually am not interested in it. And so, but if we want something, we care about something, it's important to us, or a person is important to us, doing whatever it is that needs to be done is that's what it's all about, right? So it's better to take the risk. It's better to step in than to run away, because that's the only way we have a chance. We might fail, but that's the only way that we have a chance. So we might have been conditioned to believe that we start once we've sorted things out, but we actually can start right now. So the growth begins now. The stepping in begins now, not after the cleanup. The stepping in is actually part of the cleanup. This is how we make it happen. So we can determine, do I love this enough to do this very difficult thing? And sometimes we have to say that about ourselves. Do I love myself enough to do this very difficult thing? Do I love this other person enough to do this very difficult thing? Do I love what I'm doing enough? Do I love this project enough? Do I love my work enough to do this very difficult thing? And asking ourselves, if the answer is no, what we want to do about that, whether we want to put down the project or the person or the situation completely, or whether it's we want to acknowledge that we actually love more than we thought, or whatever is in the mix there. So saying I'm not ready really can just be a socially acceptable way of saying I'm scared, right? And being vulnerable, right? Doesn't it's fear doesn't go away. Like, we're vulnerable, we're afraid, there's a risk. That's why, right? That's why it is a vulnerability. That's why it's a risk. So we, instead of waiting for fear to disappear, we do it anyway. So it's that choice to engage with what is. So it isn't like readiness isn't so much like, oh, I feel ready now. It's like, no, I'm just willing to engage with what is. I'm not running from what is anymore. So we're not going to get an invitation, right? In all of this. We're not going to have, like, it's not going to be like, okay, and now here's your sacred invitation to your life changing, right? It's like, no, it's like, here we are at this moment in time. What do we want to do? What are we able to do? How much of a risk are we willing to take? So the when we feel the least ready, when we want to run the most, that might be a sign that actually there's something really on the line, something that we really care about, right? So when we want to run the most, maybe it's because there's something that we really care about, that it's like just asking us to step in. And maybe we could look at what it is, that what part of us is ready. What part of us is ready, even if the rest of us, is afraid, is scared, is trembling. What part of us is ready and willing to take that action? Another good reminder inside of this is that our ego is the one that is seeking readiness. Our soul seeks revelation. Our soul wants to learn, it wants to grow, it wants to have opportunities. It goes through mystery, surrender, expansion. It doesn't, it's not concerned, that we fall on our face so much. Is it just wants to learn and evolve. And our ego wants everything to be like nice. It wants it to be neat. It wants us to make sure that we have it figured out. It doesn't want things to look bad or poorly done. So remembering that our soul just wants us to learn. It just wants our opportunity, an opportunity to be able to step in. And our growth doesn't require mastery. So it requires permission, right? So we just have to give ourselves permission to begin, permission to be at the beginning, to be unprepared, right? To just try. And sometimes we hold ourselves back because of comparison. We think, I'm not ready. I need to be further along. I need to be more like these other people, right? I need to kind of have more confidence or feel like I know what I'm doing more. And that's not how life gets built. We build on experience. We step in our not knowing. We get to live in our uncertainty. And then we'll know at some point in time. We'll develop, we'll grow. And each step that we take along the way builds our confidence. We become more willing to take those risks. We become more willing to become all that we can become because we get stronger and we trust more. So each moment really is an invitation. And sometimes it's like, are we saying yes or are we saying no to the invitation? That's all we're really saying. Are we running from the invitation? Or are we saying yes to the invitation? Now, that could mean many different things. It's just a willingness to take a look at what's there. And when we live in that state of honesty with ourselves, right? There are short-term pains that happen. There are failures that happen along the way. But they're just that. They're just things that happen along the way. And we'll see a lot more successes and we'll see a lot more growth and we'll see a lot more potential because we're willing to be with what is there. But if that doesn't, it's just like if you're like, "Oh, I'm still not ready. I'm not ready," right? Like, be with it in a way that kind of keeps you honest and keeps you open. Like, I'm not willing to be ready right yet, right? But I'm gonna keep on. I'm gonna show up on that level. I'm gonna show up to just acknowledging this moment in time and move just a little bit closer. But sometimes some things they take quite a bit of work. So before I just go, I'd probably just do one question, maybe two questions. You're welcome to put questions in the chat if you like. Um, some questions for you to answer. And you can write these down and answer them when you like, because it would probably be helpful to reflect on them a bit. But where in your life are you avoiding showing up? Where in your life are you avoiding showing up? What small act of presence could you offer yourself today? What small act of presence could you offer yourself today? Where have you mistaken perfection for love? And what would it mean to love imperfectly instead? Where have you mistaken perfection for love? And what would it mean to love imperfectly instead? And then I have a practice for you. So, just for this week, take a moment each morning, do something like light a candle, do something deliberate, and then say just one thing that you're willing to face that day. Could be a conversation or a feeling, anything, whatever it is, something that you're willing to face that day. All right, let's see about questions. Oh, it's a good one. So, how do I tell the difference between genuinely needing rest and just avoiding something because I don't feel ready? I really like this question. It's going to be the only question I have today because of time. But how do I tell the difference between genuinely needing rest and just avoiding something because I don't feel ready? Because many of us struggle with being overstretched, and that we're so overstretched that the idea of doing something more is like more than we can fathom. So when we get to like a place of like, oh, I really should be doing something about this part of my life or this relationship or whatever, what we have is we're like, but maybe I just like, I actually need a break here. Maybe I need some time to just regroup, right? And so, what I would say is that if there's a question around this, it might be helpful to consider your priorities in your life overall. So, the first thing that I would take a look at is where is my time and attention going? Because, as we said at the beginning, avoidance and running away can look like working too much or other things like that. So it could be that the running away behavior is resulting in the need for rest. And then the needing for rest is just being used as another running away behavior, right? So we want to take a look at how we're spending our time and if it is going in the direction of the things that are most important to us. So if it is going in the direction of most important to us, and we're needing a break, I usually say to someone, give yourself a specific amount of time. So something that seems appropriate for the situation. It could be a week, it could be a month. Give yourself a break of time and say, I'm not going to take action on this for this length of time. That way it's deliberate and intentional. I'm going to give myself a total break to take a rest. And then I'm going to take action when this amount of time is over. And that allows us then to be able to put something down, acknowledge the need for rest. But if we are trying to get away with something, we have that line in place. We're not going to go past, and we'll begin taking action moving towards at that point in time, right? Another thing about being ready is that, like, sometimes we just will not be able to rise to the occasion of stepping in and of being vulnerable. And so when we're not able to, right? Just acknowledging, okay, in that moment I wasn't able to step in, right? Okay, do I want to step in? Do I want to turn towards this and make more of this? And if your answer is yes, right? Like you care enough to want to do something, right? Then that's where it's like, okay, all right, I took a pause, but I'm going to get back at it because it's a really important thing. And if your answer is no, it might not be on your list of things that you need to turn towards. It might not be something like you might not be once you realize that you might not need to be running away from it. You might not be running away from it. You might actually just be not interested in it, right? And so if you're not interested, it's totally fine. Acknowledge that, put it down so that you're not in a dialogue with yourself about being avoidant about something else. So, if you care enough about something, typically you will find the energy to be able to deal with it. Think about examples where something was really important to you, and most of the time you found the energy to engage with that, to be able to do something about that. So that's something to keep in mind and look at it like, how important is this truly to me? And if it's not important, put it down. Take a break. You don't need more things on your list that are challenging. Just put the ones on your list that are uh, challenging and you want them. I wish I had time for more questions today, but I don't. So to remember that showing up, right? It's not about performance. It's not about getting it right. It's not about, even making something happen. It's about a practice of being with what is, engaging with what is. And we grow by doing it again and again. Not because we have to, but because we want to, because we want a deeper relationship with life, because we care, because we want to activate the potential that is all around us. And we don't need to be fixed or ready in order to get there, right? We just need to be willing, and to be willing to be more present and more engaged with ourselves, with others, with love itself. And so I want to leave you with this closing thought, right? Or sentiment. May you remember that love meets you in your willingness, not your perfection. May you remember that love meets you in your willingness, not your perfection. So I want to thank you for joining me here today. If this episode resonated with you, I'd love to hear from you. And please share your reflections or questions or comments on Sacred Lights. And thank you for being part of this evolving conversation. I will see you next time on Roar of Love.